I'm going to follow on with another litany of apologies for not having submitted a position paper. But this too is in process, and I'm hoping that some of the feedback and the gentle suggestions you make will prod me to finish this as a paper.
The two of you are not alone in that regard.
No, that's okay. Well, but anyway. So I'm going to talk about the whole idea of I'm try to be both practical and also a little bit stratospheric at the same time, and I'm going to present an idea that we might fruitfully stop talking about requirements in the same language that we've been using for, well, a long while. Requirements as being things that come before implementation. Of course they do, in the sense that requirements are purposeful. They're units of purpose. What do we want a system to do? And you can only really think about that normally in the context of a system that doesn't yet exist. And that's the standard way in which we talk about requirements, that they come first. But I think this has rather walled us into a way of thinking about requirements that is not entirely fruitful. And I'd like to suggest that we regard requirements more as something that is an external view, a black box view, rather than an internal view of the system. So these are compatible, but I think if we take this perspectival or topological view, that there's an outside or black box view of the system and an internal view of the system, rather than there's a temporal view, that there's what you do early in a project, most of, and what you do less of later on, we'll actually make more progress. And I'm going to summarize some of the high points of a couple of pieces of work, one that I did with Annie Anton several years ago on looking at the evolution of technology features in telephony, and which wasn't looking at requirements in the classical sense of what did people want the system that hadn't yet been built or was about to be revised to do, but rather to look at the history of an existing evolving technology and say how had the features evolved, and inferring in retrospect what kinds of factors had led to this, what kind of dynamics were there in the process. And secondly, work that I did with a former student of mine, Idris Shi. In his PhD, he looked at a number of applications, most prominently PowerPoint and Microsoft Word. And I'd like to reflect on actually how we use things like PowerPoint, and what does it mean to say that PowerPoint meets certain requirements, whether those requirements were identified in focus groups at Microsoft in advance or not. What does it mean to say that technologies meet requirements and how they evolve? So this actually follows on very much in terms of studying use contexts and trying to overrule the sort of design hubris that there is a customer that John was talking about, that we have to sort of adopt a more contextual view. And then I'll look at an idea that I think can help us clarify how to look at these. So it's a little bit bright. We were talking at dinner last night about how instead of just using introductory bullet point slides, I'm reflecting now on this is a kind of self-reflective talk. You can just show photographs and holiday snaps and things like this. So this is the work that I did with Annie, okay, I'm going to describe. And let me sort of set this up. So we started by looking at thinking about the evolution of telephone systems in a very informal way, following on from a lot of work that had been done in the sort of technology studies arena. People, most of you are probably familiar with Petrosky's studies of the evolution of such everyday implements as pencils, and how various factors led to their the development of various sort of features, like sort of the octagonal sort of profile of a pencil so it doesn't roll away from you and things like this. There have been some other celebrated studies in the literature of things like the evolution of the gun and the bicycle and social conventions, how they evolved. And we were interested in the use of communications technology, and particularly plain old telephones, and how something like, for example, the answering machine before voicemail, how the answering machine was used both as a an answering machine, a way of recording messages that you could get back to the caller later, but also as a screening device. So that you put, and I still have an answering machine at home. I don't have voicemail because that way you can decide whether you're going to answer the phone or not because you can hear. And we looked at some of the benefits and the burdens imposed by different features, different technology features. I mean, one of the benefits, for example, of the answering machine is that you know who's calling. One of the burdens is that you have to listen, whereas voicemail, you don't. You can consult later. If you want to use call screening, you can actually use caller ID instead. But if you use caller ID, which is now fairly standard, but you used to have to subscribe to it as a separate additional expense, you have to walk over to the phone and look at a little sort of screen that shows you the number or the identity of the caller. So there's a kind of co-location burden. From a sort of human factors perspective, you have to be co-located, whereas sound is more ambient. But of course, it's also more intrusive. So there's this profile of benefits and burdens that may not have been intended by the original designers. And frankly, who cares whether they were intended by the original designers? Who cares whether they were identified during the requirements process? Users generally don't really know exactly or can't predict what kinds of emergent additional uses or affordances that exist in the implementation of a technology that they're going to find use of later. And so, in a sense, the requirements are manifested in the use of the system when it's actually implemented, rather than being a pure intent. So what we did was we actually looked at the evolution of telephone features over a long period of time, and we studied in an archive the user manuals for telephone systems. In other words, the first few pages of the telephone book, the telephone directory from the phone company for a 40-something year period. From, I think it was 1946 through to 1999. That doesn't make, well, whatever. It was that time period, which was a very interesting sort of form of archival historical research that I hadn't been involved in before. Not the kind of thing you normally think of that, you get published in the Transactions on Software Engineering. We sort of went to the Margaret Mitchell sort of Memorial Library in Atlanta and looked at all of the sort of telephone directories for the Atlanta area for 40-something years, which was strange. And what you see, if you count the features, and there's a real issue here in research methodology, how you do this, and I'll return to that later at the end of the talk. But about how you do that. But if you look at the features, and you just grant for a moment that our research methodology was valid, you have a number of telephone features that meet certain benefits and incur certain burdens on the users. And we identified a number of different kinds of trends. There are about 4 in the paper. It's in ICSI in 2001. I'll just highlight 2 of them to emphasize some of the points that, in fact, John was making. We were discussing in some of the groups yesterday and in the open session. First is that you can identify some of the benefits like communication and accessibility of telephone systems fairly directly. Communication means you can get in touch with other people, and accessibility means they can get in touch with you. So there are various kinds of features like this. Speed dialing, for example, improves communication because you can get in touch with other people faster than you would if you had to look up their numbers or remember them. But there are also other kinds of modulating benefits, which we categorized into 3 basic areas: organization, awareness, and privacy. So organization, for example, is having being able to review who you most frequently call, for example, these kinds of information. Awareness is like different dial tones for calling different dial tones for different people. So when the phone rings in a certain way, you know that it's for one of the house occupants rather than for somebody else, or that actually, the particular feature I'm thinking of is the converse of that. You know who the call is coming from. It's one of your sort of hot list people, hot item people. So it's a form of caller ID, essentially. One of the things you find is that, as a general principle with all of these features, if you sum over them, that the basic core features come first in the evolution of the system, and the modulating benefits follow, which is hardly surprising. But I think there's actually a very interesting implication here about when we start designing features into a system, that we don't always know what the modulating features are likely to be, but we have a fairly good idea what the core features are going to be. And that the modulating features will actually, in a sense, arise, such as the privacy features, as a kind of arms race. You know, you want to stop spam, for example, if we were talking about email, and you have this arms race of different features that become necessary because of what many users would regard as abuses of the earlier features. Another thing I'll just call attention to is another notion is this benefit-burden dialectic that in a kind of, sort of Marxist or perhaps Vygotskian way, that we make the technology, we change the world, but it changes us. So we invent television and it turns us into couch potatoes. You know, and some of the benefits and the burdens interact in a way that I've already alluded to in the case of privacy, and reactive benefits, for example, benefits that are benefits because they're reactions to other uses of the technology that may be construed in certain circumstances as an abuse or a fault that wasn't previously envisaged. They also come later. So that's a kind of dynamics of technology evolution. And none of this really can be the principles of this idea. I mean, the basic outline can be predicted in advance, but not the details, I would contend. So the second thing I'd like to sort of talk about is sort of reflect on teaching and giving presentations. So here I am wandering around aimlessly in this sort of strange circular space, and you know, I'm not quite sure who to talk to and where to point myself, and using PowerPoint and all of these technologies are things that change us. Okay, so our very concept of what a presentation is changed by technology, and although we don't often think of rooms as technologies, clearly this one is. Right? I mean, in a more surfaced and obvious way than we normally take for granted. Somebody, a famous person, decided that it was better to have a kind of space like this, and for certain purposes it's much more interactive. So I'm not standing in one area and you're all in lines listening dutifully, but it's supposed to be a more engaging experience. I don't know whether it is or not, but it's supposed to be. You know, most of us here give enough presentations that we're probably not sort of too freaked out by it, but you know the advice that is given to people who are nervous at presentations, that you're supposed to imagine your audience naked so they can't threaten you. You know, I'm sort of walking around here thinking we all ought to be wearing togas, because there's something, you know, very sort of Roman and senatorial about it. But anyway, so if we look at a technology like PowerPoint, as Idris and I did, and other workpiece tools, office kind of technologies, the question is again, what are the features that are supported by what are the activities rather that the features in this technology support, and how do we therefore identify what the features really are? What does it mean to say that PowerPoint has a certain kind of feature? And so what we did was essentially to take this insight that never mind about what anybody said PowerPoint is for, or any particular technology. I'm going to use PowerPoint as the example. It was one of several. And the intuition that we had was that the user interface is a kind of portal through which is revealed the features of the technology. And since PowerPoint is a very object-oriented kind of concept, you know, you could do things with PowerPoint, but it's also it's a system for presenting objects, you know, like slides and things on the slides. It's very natural to think about PowerPoint as being a way of presenting objects. Well, what objects? Well, the user interface is essentially a kind of accurate guide to this. We're not interested in the user interface. That's actually an important topic of concern, how usable a particular product might be. But we're interested in using the user interface as a window on what lies behind it, a kind of object model. This is actually what a classic approach to data modeling, what database designers do with forms. Okay, you take the forms and you look at all the data and what's implied about the relationships between the data as is manifested by multiple forms in an organization. And you develop a conceptual schema based on those relationships after having normalized it and so on. So it's a similar kind of manual activity where you take a particular kind of presentation of information, in this case the portal to the user interface, and you infer from that what are the underlying objects, what's the ontology, what is PowerPoint's theory of presentations essentially, what do they consist of? Or what is the Palm Pilot's theory of time? What, if a Palm Pilot could tell us its theory of life, what would it be? You know, that there are 24 hours in a day is fairly uncontentious, that weekends are special might be more culturally determined, those kinds of things. But that is essentially what the application is telling us. That's the idea. And the question of whether it's right or not is really a futile, philosophically vacuous question. I mean, there is no rightness. The question is, according to the application, what is the theory? That's the important question to ask. This is actually the ontology, or it's actually a blown up portion of the ontology, and behind it is the full ontology of PowerPoint 2000. It's a very large data model. And question you might ask is, do we have some notion of what are the central concepts? One notion is not to, if we're interested in the conceptual integrity of an application, is to say, what are the most central concepts? What are the ones that appear, for example, according to some rigorous graph theoretic metrics on that previous diagram, the ones that are linked to everything else the most, the ones which are closest to everything else, the ones which have the most links, or there are a number of different kinds of centrality and cohesion metrics one can use. Actually, I won't dwell on this, but another question which is more related to context of use is to take use cases that might be taken from actual user scenarios that are observed in the field by observations. We didn't do that, so this isn't necessarily a very accurate critique of PowerPoint, and nor is it intended to be, but it's more of a sort of demonstration of a research methodology. What we did was we took the seminal work PowerPoint 2000 for Dummies, which is organized around use cases about if you want to do this with PowerPoint 2000, here's what you do. And there are, I don't know, 30-something, 40-something scenarios or use cases about what you do if you want to use a particular feature. So it's a teaching-oriented feature, teaching-oriented description of PowerPoint. And we went through all of these different use cases, essentially, and developed footprints. So if we just go back a couple, if you just look at if you think about going through a particular transaction with an interactive system as a user, what do you have to do in order to accomplish some particular task? You know, prepare a presentation, for example. Make several slides animated, these various kinds of use cases. You will actually go through a number of user interface portals, a number of dialog boxes, you will click a bunch of things. And as you do so, you're essentially illuminating through your actions various parts of the ontology underneath. You're lighting it up, you're making the ontology, you know, you're visiting parts of the model. Okay? And the question is, which parts get visited most? Which are the hotspots, essentially? Which are the core concepts that the majority of use cases consult? This relates to a question that arose yesterday when we were talking about Word, in fact, just as a hypothetical example about was it a bloated application? Was it too big? And so on. What does it mean for it to be too big? Does it just mean that it's big, or does it mean that it consists of a number of unrelated parts that tend not to be used in a consistent, coherent way? Because there's a very big difference between something that just expands and inflates and something which grows in a kind of balloon-like carbuncle growth fashion. The most important concepts are not what probably wouldn't surprise you very much are the following. But you can see that from this 3D visualization, which is based on a Spring algorithm, that there really is a kind of there are some outliers, and you can look at some of these areas and say, you know, this really doesn't belong. Or if this does belong, this would logically be a plugin. This is something that you could detach. Okay, so going on then. So those are two little sort of think pieces, and here's an idea. Pow. In case you're wondering, these are Barcelona football supporters celebrating the fact that Real Madrid didn't win the league. I want to play the individuation game, okay? and elevate this to a more theoretical level and say, what do we mean when we talk about requirements? So what's a requirement? Say we want to count requirements, or say we want to say that we've missed some. Well, what are these things? Okay, so a game that, I'm calling it a game, but it's essentially a philosophical sort of practice, conceptual analysis practice, is to say, if we're interested in singular entities of some class, like requirements or features or users, stakeholders, what is it that distinguishes different singular entities of the same class? And therefore, how can we re-identify the same one over several instances? Okay. And when have we got a changed requirement? When have we got a new one? These are not idle questions. These are quite important questions, even though the answer might ultimately be somewhat arbitrary and based on a sort of ad hoc definition. If we apply it consistently, it's important for research methodology. How can we therefore distinguish individuals and count them? And how do we compose them into bigger entities? Because obviously some requirements can be regarded as, I mean, if you look at like the preference literature, the literature on the preferences among requirements, you can decompose things hierarchically and rate them and rank them. So what are the classes of entities in which we're interested? Well, typically we've talked about requirements, but requirements is also essentially, although in English grammar it isn't really the case, we use it rather like a mass noun rather than a count noun. We talk about the requirements. We talk about a lot of requirements. Requirements coming before design, but we don't really say this requirement, another requirement, except in certain specialized areas. Whereas features are more kind of granular, whatever they are. In Idris's work, we tried to coin this term teleon, which suggested a kind of unit of purposeful activity, but that didn't really catch on, so never mind. I'm going to suggest, just to close, based on a paper that I had in RE 07, no, it's 07 now, 06, that we can use problem frames, Michael Jackson's notion of problem frames, as a way of categorizing different kinds of feature and talking about them. I just want to sort of illustrate what I mean by this. As most of you know, Jackson thinks about problems as, or not really system type, but problem types as falling into, I think, 4 or 5 different categories. And one of them is essentially that function, the transformation. That a compiler, for example, transforms, or the main function of a compiler is to transform language or text in one language to text in another language, code in one language to code in another language. But of course, that's a gross simplification because there are many, many sort of sub-features involved in that, sub-steps and other auxiliary activities which really aren't easily thought of as transformational because they involve state. They involve a lot of recurring state. But this is one way that we can think about requirements. Right? So we could ask how many functions are there. That wasn't what we did with PowerPoint because we didn't really think of PowerPoint as essentially a very functional or transformational kind of system. You can, it's true, look at any system in this way. You could say, you know, any system consists of basically a function from a history of user input commands into an output. But that's not a very fruitful or user-oriented way of thinking about this. You think about there being some kind of state very normally. But it's true that some features or some requirements might be inherently transformational, some little ones. Okay? If we were to do some kind of function point analysis for the new millennium, a new kind of way of looking at this, I think it might be fruitful to do some function point and other kinds of problem frame point analysis, distinguish the different kinds. Jackson calls the second kind of problem frame information display. I think of this more as a kind of oracle. You think of a system, or at least some of the problems that a system solves, as being oracular. You, the user, have a question, and you want an answer to the question. That question could actually be answered by going out and looking at the world, by a sensing system. But normally, in our trade, we think of it as being an information system where the information has been modeled, cached, and you get an answer about a database, from a database rather than, or from a simulation model rather than from the real world directly. But you have a question, you get an answer. There are big questions, of course, here about what it means for the answer to be correct, and the social construction of the information that's in the model, even when, as in this particular example, it seems ostensibly physical and uncontentious. How many planets are there? There's a big passionate debate about that last year, wasn't there? It's not that easy at all. You know, lots of people got extremely angry about it, including professional astronomers, not just school kids. You know, don't take Pluto away from us. But this again isn't. I mean, I don't want to get into the issue of what it means for the things to be correct, but you can regard the number of queries, different kinds of queries or different kinds of questions you want answered, as being unitary features, unitary functions, unitary requirements. But these are of different kinds than a transformational kind of requirement. Penultimately, we have workpiece problems where you're creating something with the artifact, with the technology. PowerPoint is actually an instance of that. You have a number of different editing operations or different kinds of modifications. And finally, you have control and influence problems, which I think are in many ways becoming the most significant, not just because they're the socially most significant in terms of real-time systems and the possible hazards that emerge from them, but also because even something like a telephone system involves a lot of control and influence over people, over other parts of technology, that you're monitoring things, so a number of monitoring observation operations. What kinds of observations do we want to perform? What kinds of connections are there between observations and responses? This kind of paired stimulus-response pairing can also be regarded as a unit that we count. Okay? If the train enters when the signal is red, then do the following. That if-then condition could be regarded as a unit that we measure or we individuate as a requirement or as a feature, and that we can contest and argue about. And once it's frozen, perhaps it's frozen. So what have I talked about? Okay. The idea is that I think that we don't necessarily need to change the way we talk about requirements, but we need to enlarge it. Rather than just talking about before and after and stipulated requirements, that a customer wants requirements, they're kind of documented, contracted, frozen, maybe renegotiated later, but there's a kind of finality to them, at least that's at least temporary. One way of looking at requirements is to say the real requirements that are met by a system are the ones that are used and are manifested in the use context in a sort of human-centered way. Secondly, rather than just looking at, and I suppose this is in another way just a kind of take on the same point, rather than focusing on the intent and supposed goals, we look at praxis, we look at practice. What kind of activities do people engage in? And that tells us really what the requirements are. So one of the requirements for the answering machine was call screening, whether or not that was an intended documented requirement or not, because that's how users have chosen to use it. It's one of the main features. And rather than concentrating solely on specification as a goal, documentation, specification, validation, all of the things associated with putting something in an explicit form, which is important, we concentrate very much, we concentrate also, I think, on use contexts. And I don't just mean envisaged use context and doing ethnography and implying what we want the system to do in the future. I mean looking at actual fielded systems, much as some architecture theorists do with buildings, where they do post-occupancy analysis. This isn't just an issue of usability, it's an issue of how do we want the technology to evolve, how do we understand it. And in the case of PowerPoint, for example, not just is it usable, is it a good system, but what does it tell us about what a presentation is? How has it changed and redefined our notion of what a presentation is? How does a word processor change the notion of what a document is? What is a time management system or calendar system theory of life? These, sort of stated in a slightly overblown metaphorical way, are actually quite literal, serious questions. Thank you.
Okay, Colin.
Hey,
I think the first point, a lot of us would subscribe to the attempt to sort of say, okay, requirements are mainly a notational convenience, a documentation convenience, whether you call them features, TLONs, services, choose your weasel word, and that really understanding of need emerges through a modeling, analysis, dialogue activity.
Right.
Now, the tension is, but, okay, you're pushing the idea, and I subscribe to that observation of artifact in use, ethnographic, whatever, generates understanding. But that, of course, is retrospective.
Yes.
And then you've got the problem of how you combine that with the dialogue of the vision of the future.
Absolutely.
Something that is transformational. And how do you do the balance there? Are you in a particular genre of domain where one is more appropriate and you're just doing evolution of requirements and the retrospection is great? Or are you transformational going into new pastures?
Well, I think one of the things there's no magic answer to this, obviously. I mean, you can't really predict what the future is going to be. We're always surprised by users. But one thing you can do, I think, is you could use the sort of insights that we hinted at with these different dynamics for the telephone system, telephony feature evolution. That, for example, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to require customization features early in the history of a system, because it turns out that people designers and users alike have very little insight about what features they want to customize or individualize or personalize until they have some experience with several generations of it. And that's why most customization features tend to focus more on fairly superficial aspects of like color schemes and so on, rather than sort of definitions of concept. Now, that may not be true in all cases, but it's a sort of that's a kind of rough guideline that we don't want to spin our wheels and spend a lot of time asking people questions about, well, would you like it to do this in a special way or that in a special way? Yeah.
I think there's another spin that you can look at it on that sort of transformational incremental model and use that history very, very productively. But then there's the interesting thing, you can use those sort of studies as an artifact to react against and just say, how do we tear this all up?
That's right.
Do something radically different. Right.
I mean, actually, I sort of suggested to put in the provocations page, in fact, and I was more than half serious about this, that something like presentation technologies is something that we could actually rethink, I mean, as a community, because we give presentations all the time, okay? We shouldn't, this is not a criticism of PowerPoint or any other technology or overhead projectors or blackboards, but we don't need to be hidebound by a particular view. I mean, we're all experts in this particular area as well as potential developers. So I think there is always this trade-off between incremental improvement, which is something inevitable with many systems, large systems, telephone systems, air traffic control and so on. You can't rethink the internet, okay? But you can rethink particular point technologies that might be very, very powerful, very valuable.
So one question I would like to raise, based on, so for example, Alistair, you used the phrase weasel words, choose your weasel words. But yesterday we also heard essentially that requirements engineering from an educational perspective is broccoli, right? Making students take their vegetables. And then you make the case, and I think persuasively, that we have to treat the way we view the requirements undertaking. I think it's a real question for this group as to whether or not we want to consider different nomenclature. Are there words we want to adopt or other words that we want to sort of set aside? If we're looking for a research agenda out over the next 10 years, is there a need for new nomenclature? It's just a question I pose to the group as much as anything.
It's actually an interesting question because I mean, many people have mixed feelings about this sort of thing. That we can get stuck on conceptual distinctions that are a little bit sort of fruitless. And what's the difference between this and that? And how are we going to use a word when they're all everyday words? This was actually why we tried to coin the term teleon, because we were tired of explaining when we mean a feature, we mean this rather than that. And we sort of oscillated between feature and service. But I do think there might be some value in sort of having a moratorium on the word requirement in the singular and using some alternative term that was perhaps more meaningful and more precise and more connotative in its meaning, like a feature, something which is observed, not necessarily desired by or needed by, but something which is observable by. as a sort of kind of unitary component, not something that's implemented in a particular way, but something which in a black box fashion is observed as a use case was actually a coined term, which I think there's been a huge amount of controversy about what that really means, but I think that's actually been quite valuable in the sense that a use case really does emphasize that it's something which is triggered by some external initiating action by a user or external entity and what follows in its train. We might well fruitfully look at some sort of terminological issues like this, if we can all agree on them. Okay.